Okay, I'm going to get started now that we've got over 10 people who have joined. I believe that there will be quite a few more joining, but we've only got 30 minutes, so I'll get stuck in. So good afternoon, everyone, actually. Welcome to Bioregional's 30-minute webinar on what net zero means for your business. I'm Steph Schlipper, and I'm the principal consultant of the Sustainable Business team at Bioregional. I'll be running the session today. We are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing it with all participants after the session. And, feel free to add any questions that come up for you in the chat. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, but any questions that we don't get time to answer, we'll circulate the answers following the session too. So what we're going to cover today is sort of some jargon busters around net zero and carbon. We'll talk about what a carbon footprint entails, what it actually means to commit to net zero as a business. I'll provide some information on, ways you might start reducing your carbon emissions. And I'll end with how Bioregional can help if that's of interest. And ultimately, we'll come to the end and open it up to questions from the audience. So I'm sure most of you on the call are familiar with Bioregional to some degree, but I'll just set the scene by sharing a bit on who we are. Bioregional is a purpose-led, not-for-profit, and multi-award winning sustainability consultancy. We work in two areas primarily, which is one on corporate sustainability and the other side being sustainability in the built environment. We work with a wide range of partners, so working with small businesses, large charities to multinational retailers, and even local authorities. Something that's particularly worth noting for this session is that Bioregional is also a founding member of the Carbon Accounting Alliance. So we'll get stuck in to carbon and net zero jargon busters. Hopefully the next few slides will help you feel more confident talking about these concepts with your stakeholders. So we're going to start with carbon footprinting and some of the terms around that. A carbon footprint is the measurement of the total greenhouse gases, or GHGs, produced directly and indirectly by an organization and its operations. If you look at the clouds at the top of this diagram, you'll see the 6 greenhouse gases. The one on the left is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is just one of the 3 of the greenhouse gases. When you complete a carbon footprint, the total is expressed as CO2e, which is carbon dioxide equivalents. And that represents all of the greenhouse gases multiplied by their global warming potential into a single common unit. So while carbon dioxide, emissions, greenhouse gases, CO2e, they're not completely the same thing. They are used rather interchangeably when we're talking in the context of carbon footprinting. Likewise, carbon footprint has multiple names. So some of, if people are talking to you about your carbon footprint, whether they be customers or investors, they might be asking for your carbon accounting, for your GHG inventory, or your carbon assessment. So the graph that we're actually looking at on the screen is a figure from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which has created the international best practice standard for carbon footprinting. It divides carbon footprint into 3 scopes, 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 and 2 are generally those emissions associated with your direct activities and usually energy-based emissions. So from your purchased electricity or fuel use to, say, heat or run company vehicles or equipment. Scope 3 is everything that happens, any emissions from your upstream activities or downstream activities in your supply chain. It's really important to look at the different icons in the Scope 3 arrows because these represent different emission categories under Scope 3. They can range from staff commuting and business travel to logistics. Importantly, they also cover your suppliers' emissions, particularly under purchased goods and services. So it's quite a lot that happens in scope 3. And because of that, about 90% of, or up to 90% of a company's carbon footprint can be in scope 3. So net zero, in its most simplest form, is when an organization has zero contribution to atmospheric carbon levels. And I'll come back to what this means in terms of target setting for a business later. But I just wanted to differentiate net zero from carbon neutral, carbon neutrality, which you might have also heard, which is when an organization emits, say, carbon emissions, and they balance that with purchasing offsets that avoid, reduce, or remove the equivalent emissions elsewhere. It's important to note that offsetting has received quite a bit of controversy lately, and also the concept of carbon neutral is receiving a crackdown across the UK and the EU. So it's really important that when you're talking with your stakeholders, you're really using the terminology net zero and not carbon neutral. So carbon footprinting is a really big topic and there's a lot to it. But, you know, we're in a short webinar, and what I wanted to focus on specifically is what a carbon footprint entails for a company, particularly for those of you that are just getting started on this process. So a carbon footprint process entails multiple steps, including determining your organizational and operational boundary. When we talk about your organizational boundary, it's which sites or assets are going to be included in your footprint. And when we talk about the operational boundary, it's those emission categories that I showed you on the graph. Which of those emission categories are relevant based on your operational context? So you really need to figure out what's in scope and what's out of scope for your carbon footprint upfront. Then you'll need to select your base year and do your baseline, which is basically the first year you calculate your carbon emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3. You'll need to choose your reporting year. It could be a calendar year, could be a financial year. You'll need to collect operational data and calculate your emissions. This is probably the most challenging part for a lot of organizations, so I'll come back to that in a sec. But ultimately, once you've calculated your footprint, you need to report your emissions internally, externally, annually. So if we look at data collection and calculation a bit more closely, we're really talking about collecting data from your operations. So you should have a lot of this data, you know, floating around already. This will include data from utility bills, from mileage records, from your purchase ledger. It should also include the carbon data from your suppliers where possible. But you might not have all of this data tracked, you know, in your first baseline. So there are ways that you can fill in gaps with secondary sources such as national averages or other estimates to address issues in your data. Once you've got your operational data, you need to select appropriate emission factors. So these are relevant to the emissions activity in question, the particular time frame that they occurred, and often the location in which they were emitted. So this is probably one of the most technical aspects, is choosing the correct emission factors. But ultimately, once you have your operational data and your emission factors, you can multiply those together to create a carbon footprint, usually through a digital tool or more manually through Excel. So how long does it take? How much does it cost? So many organizations really want to know the answer to this question, and I'd love to give you a clear answer, but it's really not that clear. It ultimately depends on you, your organization, and the calculation approach you take. One of the biggest factors around time is really how long it takes to collect that operational data. You know, that will depend on competing priorities, the data systems you have in place already, but that can range anywhere from, say, a month to up to 10 months. So that's really where it's up to you about how long it takes for a carbon footprint. So the three main approaches are using a digital online calculator. So these are really useful a quick way to get started and find carbon hotspots. Sometimes they're quite limited in flexibility and accuracy, though. For example, you might not be able to add supplier-specific data into the tool. And that will particularly be sort of your free carbon calculators online. But they do also cost money, and that will generally be based on your company size and or turnover as to the pricing scale. Many organizations also choose to, do it themselves using an Excel tool and picking out the correct emission factors. This is definitely more difficult to get started, and you'll definitely probably require training, upskilling, time to do this on an annual basis as well. There is a higher risk of human error in an Excel as well, but it does give you more flexibility and particularly independence to be able to do your carbon footprint each year yourself. Finally, engaging consultants to provide support is a route that many organizations take. It does have a higher cost, but that does vary depending on the consultancy. And ultimately, it will be about company complexity as well. So usually the cost depends on the size or turnover of the organization. What I can share today is that an average for a small to medium size organization is usually around £10,000. But what you do get with using consultants is a more supportive more support and guidance, and also more confidence in the methodology and result. And that could be particularly important when you're doing your first baseline. So committing to net zero, what does it actually mean for a business? So you're probably seeing this a lot in the news on a day-to-day. You're seeing, household name organizations like M&S and Tesco committing to net zero. You've heard that the UK government has committed to net zero by 2050, and you may have seen some news about different sort of compliance requirements or policies coming out around net zero. So what this means is that these organizations or entities are setting a carbon reduction target that aligns with the global ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This ambition is driven by the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI as it's also known, is probably the global authority on setting carbon reduction targets aligned with science. They also validate targets for private sector organizations. So they've created the corporate net zero standard and define net zero as achieving at least 90% reduction in absolute emissions across all scopes by 2050. This is also referred to maybe as your net zero target, your long-term target. Then companies need to neutralize the remaining emissions. So those residual 10% emissions need to be neutralized through permanent carbon removal and storage solutions. It also includes setting a near-term target to reduce emissions within the next 5 to 10 years from your baseline. And best practice currently is to reduce your emissions by 50%, usually by 2030. But we're getting closer to 2030 each year. So it can be quite an ambitious goal. What I will say about SBTI is that they do charge to validate your targets, but they do release all of their standards and guidance for free on their website. So you can read the guidance and commit to net zero without actually having to pay for it to be validated. The graph on the right depicts the SBTI's net zero standard. And I think this really helps to put, a visual to what that trajectory should look like for your organization and really what you would expect to work towards over the coming years for your interim target and for your long-term target. But in terms of practical steps on moving forward to committing to net zero and building out a strategy, you really need that carbon footprint baseline to be able to set a target and to track progress towards any sort of target you do set. So that's essential up front. You will have flexibility to decide your specific near-term and long-term targets. The long-term targets, or the net zero target in particular, cannot be beyond 2050 for it to align with science, but there is a lot of flexibility about moving that forward. You see a lot of organizations committing to net zero by 2030 or 2040. You also see a lot of organizations having quite a lot of flexibility around their near-term targets. So some might be doing 50% by 2030, some might be doing 60% by 2035. So you do have flexibility. Once you have agreed your net zero target internally, then you really need to start identifying short, medium, and long-term actions to reduce those emissions year on year. You'll need to come back to this quite frequently because your internal context, as well as the external context, particularly around innovation and decarbonization across sectors, needs to be factored into your decarbonization strategy as we get closer to 2050. So do come back to that quite frequently once you've got your action plan. Then to actually be able to track your progress, you'll need to calculate your carbon footprint every year and ideally report, both your carbon footprint and your progress towards your targets publicly annually. There are quite a few undeniable business benefits of carbon accounting and net zero, well, working towards net zero. So as I said already, the UK government has committed to net zero, and we are seeing this in a certain amount of compliance requirements, regulations, and policies. You may have heard of SECA, you may have heard of the PPN 0621 procurement note. So they have these compliance requirements, and they're usually for the biggest organizations right now, but those big organizations are also then cascading down those requirements to their stakeholders, to their suppliers. So you might have already been asked by, one of your customers or investors to share your carbon data or your net zero or science-based targets. For example, Tesco asked all of their suppliers to, commit to science-based targets by the end of 2023. Beyond sort of that stick process is, the carrot, which are the real opportunities. So, by reducing your environmental impacts and being able to talk about that without greenwashing, can really help to build brand reputation and take up more market share. You will need to engage your supply chain as you do your carbon footprinting and work towards net zero. And, really engaging your supply chain can really help build better business relationships and also help streamline your supply chain. But I think one of the key points that I really want to stress, which lots of organizations maybe don't appreciate immediately, is that by looking more closely at your operational data, so looking at the energy use, looking at how much packaging you purchase, or all of those things, helps you identify any sort of inefficiencies in your systems and processes. It helps you to identify ways that you can streamline your business, and this will ultimately save you money. If you can produce the same outputs with less energy, then ultimately you're going to save money. If you reduce the packaging from the goods that you send out, you'll save money. So I'm going to move on to sharing a few pointers around how you can get started on reducing your carbon emissions. But this is a really big topic, and this is only a short webinar, so I'm going to go quite quickly through these. But you will have the slides after this anyway. So scope 1 and 2, which were those energy-related emissions I referenced at the beginning. Ultimately, the quickest way to reduce your emissions in this area is to switch to a renewable energy tariff or ask your landlord to make the switch. If you're lucky enough to own your own site, you could invest in on-site installation of renewables, which will not only help you decarbonize, but it will also help you sort of insulate against those risks of, instability in energy prices. In terms of reducing energy use and improving energy efficiency, there's lots that you can do around here, from being better at turning off equipment, installing lighting or heating sensors, optimizing your processes, installing LED lighting, upgrading your equipment to more efficient models, investing in installation, even if it's just DIY draft proofing, can really help the energy efficiency of your building. So if you do have company vehicles, you'll really need to also crack down on fuel use. So that could be, taking virtual meetings instead of driving to a meeting. It could be taking public transport, buying vehicles that have a better fuel efficiency, driving more efficiently, and ultimately electrification, which we're seeing a lot. But it is worth noting that it's really best if you're charging those electrical vehicles with renewables. That's where you'll really see impact. Then scope 3, again, there's so much we can talk about in this area, but to do a quick run through, by reducing your waste to landfill and reducing your water use, you will see a reduction in your carbon emissions. You can choose to buy less, you can choose to reuse or repurpose items, you can buy refurbished products and ultimately recycle. You can put up messaging to your staff around, remembering to use less water or create less waste. You can also install low flow taps or low flush toilets. Engaging staff and providing them with incentives can be really impactful as well. Lots of organizations have a green group or an environmental champions initiative that helps decentralize rolling out that net zero strategy. You can offer them cycle to work schemes, salary sacrifice schemes for EVs, or create competitions between departments to drive decarbonization. If you travel, you can look at more sustainable options such as virtual meetings instead, direct flights, taking public transport, or checking into eco hotels. If you have products, you should really lean into the circular economy principles, or you can choose materials that have a lower carbon intensity. And again, really looking at that packaging. Can you do with less packaging? For service-based industries, a big part of their carbon emissions will be in their purchased goods and services. So you can look at how you can select greener suppliers and engaging existing suppliers to do more. You could do this through your due diligence process, asking them to share their carbon data and net zero target, or providing them capacity building support to come on the journey with you. You can vote with your wallet and make sure that any investments, pension funds or banks aligned with your company are more sustainable and do not invest in fossil fuels. And finally, think big. How can you innovate and diversify your business model towards the green economy? What new products can you offer? Which lines can you discontinue? How can you actually pivot towards a net zero future? So we're coming to the end, and I just wanted to share how Bioregional can help if that's of interest to any of you. We work with a lot of organizations, shapes and sizes, but we can offer a full scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon footprint for any size organization. We can also offer carbon footprinting for particular product lines, and you may want to do comparisons between certain products as well. We've supported very large organizations and smaller organizations actually to set and validate their science-based targets through the SBTi. We've helped lots of clients develop those net zero glide paths, so the trajectory towards net zero and the strategies and action plans that underpin that goal. We've done quite a bit of thinking around, the time and the cost implications, particularly for small to medium-sized organizations. So we've also created a new service, which is the all-in-one carbon accounting toolkit for SMEs, which gives SMEs everything they need to conduct their baseline across scopes 1, 2, and 3 using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards. In that service, we give them access to the industry-leading Compare Your Footprint digital tool, which has a lot more emission factors than a lot of the other tools out there. But this all-in-one carbon toolkit, you get a range of templates, resources, workshops, and interaction opportunities with other SMEs. So that's what I wanted to share with you. It's a very big topic to cover in 30 minutes, but hopefully there was some useful nuggets in there for you. But we do have about 5 minutes where I can start taking questions. And also, I said, if we don't get to all the questions, I will follow up with some write-up answering them for all of the participants. I'm just seeing what questions have come in. It's loading a little bit.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steph. Do you want me to read any out from the?
Yeah, I was looking in Q&A, but yeah, please do.
Yeah, first one. Thanks so much, Prasanna Siva. Hope I pronounced your name correctly. So yeah, we've got a question. What's the difference between net zero and SBTI? Is SBTI a lower target? Whether you could just touch on that again.
So SBTI is actually a body, the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they are the global authority for creating the standards around setting science-based targets. So net zero is just one of the approaches you can take to setting a science-based target. So you can also set targets aligned with a 2-degree warming, which isn't recommended now, or a 1.5-degree warming scenario. Net zero is somewhere in between those, but yeah, having a net zero target, if you want to do that where it's best practice, you should look to the SBTI's guidance on their corporate net zero standard. Which will help you set that. But if you are an SME, you can also commit to net zero quite quickly and easily through the SME Climate Hub, which aligns you with the UN Race to Zero, which is but it's less flexibility, which basically commits you to reducing your emissions by 50% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. Hopefully that helps to clarify that.
Brilliant, thanks, Steph. Prasanna, we'll get back to your other question about landlords afterwards, I think. We'll move on. Another question, what are Scope 4 emissions about?
Well, we weren't going to cover those in this session, but Scope 4 emissions really are about, what you can do beyond with your supply chain and what you can do beyond that still have an impact on, decarbonization across the economy. But that's a whole new area that's emerging and isn't really been cemented in the greenhouse gas protocol standards yet.
Thank you. 2 more questions in the chat. Is anyone doing salary sacrifice for helping employees to retrofit homes? Don't know if you don't know, Steph, we can ask around the built environment team. That might be one for them.
Yeah, we can ask our built environment colleagues if they have any examples of that, and we'll share it after the session. I don't work on that side, I'm sorry.
So I'm just throwing you all the difficult questions, Steph. Anyway, last one, can you please give an example of net zero glide paths and strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where some of the jargon comes in as well. So definitely happy to, clarify this a bit. So a net zero glide path is the net zero trajectory, which I showed you on that graph where you have your baseline and you're working towards 90% reduction by 2050. That is called a glide path in some sense. It's also called a net zero trajectory. It's basically how you should see your emissions reduce over time towards the goal that you've set yourself. Whereas a strategy is really getting more into the nuts and bolts of how you're going to achieve net zero. So that's any key pillars you might work towards. Maybe depending on your business model, you'll want to work on products or energy efficiency, and building out your proper strategy, which is then underpinned by an action plan. So a strategy will include maybe more, defined targets, by those emission categories. For example, you might have a carbon budget for travel where you're aligning to reduce the emissions of your business travel by 20% by 2030 in particular. So a strategy is built up not only of that overarching net zero target, but also a range of different targets for each of the emission categories, and ultimately an action plan to achieve the targets that you've set yourself. So hopefully that helps. Any other questions?
That was it. That was it for questions. Thanks so much,
Okay.
everybody. Thank you, Steph. Yeah, I'll let you wrap up. Thank you.
Only 2 minutes over time. Thanks for joining, everyone. I really do hope that was helpful. It is a big topic, but do get in touch if you want any support. All right. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. Bye.